Okay, so 6.5 is all about neurons and synapses. And neurons and synapses are making up our nervous system. And it's a system, so it's highly complex. And the nervous system is essentially allowing animals to coordinate actions. It transmits signals from one part of the body to another part of the body. And that transmission is via an electrical impulse, which we're going to call an action potential. Your nervous system is also working to detect changes in the body or actually outside of the body in some cases. And also the nervous system is working in tandem with the endocrine system. Okay, so again, it's highly complex. What we can see here is some brain neurons. If we look at the syllabus statements, okay, they're here, and I would obviously encourage you to go and check in with all of these individually, but I want to start just thinking about the classification of the different parts of the nervous system. So we've got a central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. So we've got the brain is made up of lots and lots of nerves, and the synapse is the connection between the nerves. And then all the way down through here, we've got the spinal cord. Make sure that you are distinguishing between the spinal cord and the vertebral column. The vertebral column is the bony part which goes around the outside of the spine. The spine is made of nerve. The vertebral column is made of bone. Then what we've got is running into our central nervous system and out of our central nervous system, we've got what is called the peripheral nervous system. So we've got the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and then everything going in and out is part of a peripheral nervous system. We've got a sensory part, which is the part that is going in. And the sensory nervous system is allowing us to detect changes in one part of the body and transmit it to the central nervous system. Or we could be picking up information, sensing information on the outside of the body, and again, sending that signal to the central nervous system. The motor nervous system is going in the opposite direction. So the sensory is going from a receptor into the central nervous system, whereas the motor nerve is running from the central nervous system out to an effector. And an effector could be a muscle or it could be a gland. Now, motor system is also complicated because we need to subdivide that further into two parts. We've got the somatic and the autonomic motor system. So again, we've got the central part, and then we've got the peripheral part. The peripheral is in and out. If we want to classify the in and out, the peripheral, we've got the sensory going in and the motor going out. And now we're going to subdivide further the motor system. The somatic is the motor system which sends a message out, which you might want to clap your hands because you're happy. Now, the clapping of the hands because you're happy is deliberate, it's voluntary. We're talking here about somatic, voluntary control. As opposed to if you get excited and your heart starts beating, you don't deliberately say, hey, heart, start beating faster. We are doing it unconsciously. We're doing it involuntarily. This is part of our autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system, again, is a division of that motor system. If we take the autonomic nervous system, we can then subdivide that also into two branches, which are called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch. And the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch do the opposite of one another. So generally, the sympathetic nervous system tends to speed things up, like the heart, whereas the parasympathetic nerve starts to, in general, slow things down. So they have opposite effects, which gives you very, very fine control. So first of all, just spend some time just making sure that you're clear with the terminology here. Then we need to think about how the tissue of the nerve is organized. And I want you to appreciate that individual nerves are specialized cells. Hopefully you know that already. And we've got bundles of these nerves all together. So we've got nerve tissue. And nerve tissue is made up of these bundles. You can see them here, where we've got motor and sensory nerves all aligned next door to each other. And we've got these membrane arrangements around bundles of nerve fiber. So we've got many, many neurons. Neuron is an individual cell that's making up tissue, but the tissue is mixed tissue. It's got sensory and motor all bundled up together, obviously conducting in opposite directions. And that's important for us to appreciate. So we've got lots and lots of membranous sheaths here. You can see also we've got blood vessels because the nerve must receive a supply of oxygen because actually it's a very energy expensive tissue. So we've got oxygenated blood here shown in red and then deoxygenated blood here. So again, just to be familiar with that terminology. Now, there are 3 different types of nerves, but the one that we need to make sure that we're clear about for 6.5 is the motor nerve. So the types of nerve, we've got motor nerves, sensory nerves, and intermediate nerves, which are also known as relay, sometimes known as internuncial nerves too. So the motor nerve is the big one, okay, and here we've got the motor nerve, and we need to look at the structure and the function of those parts in a little bit of detail, which we'll come to in a moment. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the cell body here contains the nucleus. So the nucleus inside this cell is here within a cell body, and the direction in which the impulse is going to flow is along this extension here, which is called the axon, and it's going to go to an effector. The effector here is either a muscle or a gland. So we've got the cell body at this end sending an impulse in this direction to an effector of some description. Also, the motor nerve is referred to as a myelinated nerve because it's surrounded by a myelin fatty sheath. We'll come back to that in just a second. So this one here is the motor nerve. The opposite is this one, which is the sensory nerve. Remember, the sensory and the motor nerves are bundled up together. Notice the axon shape here and the axon shape here. So the cell body, the cell body, not the axon, pardon me. The cell body is not at the end, it's stuck out just here. And what we've got is the receptor, which is picking up, detecting a change. This is a cell which is separate. So we've got a receptor cell. It could be a thermoreceptor detecting heat. It could be a touch receptor. It could be a chemoreceptor. So we've got all sorts of receptors, and the receptors are allowing us to detect change. And when we pick up that change, this receptor will become electrically excited. And if it becomes enough at threshold electrically excited, it's going to send an impulse from the receptor towards the central nervous system along the axon here to this end part, which is called the dendrite. And this is inside the central nervous system. So what we've got is the impulse passing from the receptor to the central nervous system. Here in the motor nerve, this part is actually inside the central nervous system. So the cell body is in the central nervous system, conducting the impulse outwards to the effector here. And this one is called an intermediate neuron, which actually connects these two. And if we look at the next slide here, this is what we need to appreciate mostly. This is the structure of the motor neuron, and we touched on this at GCSE. This is what you need to be able to draw and label and understand. So terminology is important. Here we've got what's referred to as the cell body. It's sometimes referred to as the soma. It's the same thing. Here we've got the nucleus, and the nucleus is very, very rich in rough endoplasmic reticulum because this is doing a lot of protein synthesis. And here you can see individual vesicles. The protein is going to be thrown out of the nucleus and into the cytoplasm here. We'll come back to this idea later on. It's very energy expensive. I've already alluded to that, and you can understand why in a second. So we've also got lots and lots of mitochondria, which are found here too. So this is cytoplasm. It's sometimes called axoplasm because it's inside the axon here as well. And the axon is this extended long part of the nerve here, which ends in the axon terminal. Remember that this part, the cell body, is actually inside the central nervous system, and this part here, the axon terminal, is going to be inside the effector of a muscle or a gland. We've got these ends, which are called dendrites. These are the receivers, and make sure that you appreciate that the dendrites are distinct from the axon terminal. So this is the terminal, this is at the end because the impulse is flowing in this direction. I already said that motor nerves, also sensory nerves, are myelinated. So we've got this myelin sheath, which is around the outside here. And these myelin sheaths are created by cells which are called Schwann cells. So we've got Schwann cells, like an accessory cell here, which is wrapping a fatty tissue around the outside of the axon. So we've got the axon, which is this central elongated part of our actual neuron cell. Then we've got Schwann cells creating these myelin sheaths around the outside, and that serves to insulate the electrical impulse. And essentially what happens is when the impulse passes in this direction, it can physically jump from one part here to the next. This is called a node, and it jumps from one node to the other node. So myelinated nerves are going to conduct impulses very quickly. This is called saltatory conduction. So we've got the actual main nerve, which is the neuron. We've got these accessory nerves called the Schwann cells. The Schwann cells are making myelin, which is a fatty insulating, electrically insulating material, which speeds up the conduction. Hopefully that's fairly familiar to you from GCSE. Also familiar from GCSE, I hope, is the idea of a reflex. And what we've got here is a reflex action. Reflex actions are largely involuntary, and I want us to think about it in terms of a stimulus response chain. So the stimulus is a change in the environmental condition. That change is detected by a receptor, and then we've got a series of events, electrical events, which are all to do with our nervous system. So we've got some kind of receptor that is detecting change, a chemoreceptor, a thermoreceptor, etc., etc., etc. So this one happens to be in the skin. And then this blue line here is meant to represent the sensory neuron. And you can see the direction is going to be along here. And you notice also that we've got the cell body, which is lying just outside this part here, which is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is the central nervous system. And the spinal cord has got these two regions, which we'll come back to later on. But what we've got here is the end of the nerve, the axon terminal, and the axon terminal is inside the central nervous system. So the sensory neuron is transmitting an impulse in this direction. Notice that the cell body is just outside of the spinal cord, and then it enters dorsally. So it enters the spinal cord from the back side. Then you've got a gap. That gap is called a synaptic gap. And what we've got in green is another neuron, which is called an internuncial or a relay neuron or an intermediate neuron. Now, the events that happen at this gap here, the synaptic gap, are chemical. So we've got an electrical phenomena, and then we've got a chemical phenomena, then we've got an electrical phenomena, we've got another synapse here, so we've got another chemical phenomena, and then we've got the output, which is an electrical impulse along the motor nerve to the effector. And again, can you notice that the cell body is inside the central nervous system here, and the axon terminal is in the effector. Also, to pay attention to the fact that this blue one, the sensory neuron, and the red one, the motor neuron, are both myelinated nerves. They both have got that fatty sheath. They both conducting impulses very, very, very quickly. Here, similar sort of effect. This is again showing you that we can have receptors. This one is a stretch receptor, and we've got the patellar tendon reflex that you can read about. But again, we've got the input coming here. We've got the sensory nerve, and the sensory nerve here, you've got the axon, the cell body. And what's important to appreciate is here we've got an impulse, which is an axon terminal, which is running into the central nervous system. Then we've got a monosynaptic reflex in this case, and the motor neuron coming out again to the effector. You notice here too that we've got an impulse going up to the brain. So as the sensory neuron is coming in, we've got some kind of coordination which is happening at the level of the spinal cord, sending an impulse back out. And at the same time, we're sending the message up to the brain so that we can be consciously aware of it. But because this is a monosynaptic reflex, the reflex happens too quickly for the brain to have an effect. Now, there are some occasions, if you've got something like this, where you've got an impulse which is also sent up to the brain via the sensory neuron here. And because we've got more than one synapse which is taking place, we can, from the brain, have an impulse coming down, which is going to block the synapse here. We're going to come back to this idea when we look at the structure of the synapse in more detail later on. But for now, I want you to appreciate the structure of the sensory neuron, the structure of the motor neuron in particular, because oftentimes they might ask you to draw that. Be aware that we've got this internuncial or relay neuron. We can have lots of these, or few of these, or none of these. So we can have monosynaptic reflexes or polysynaptic reflexes. Again, hoping that you know most of this from GCSE, so this is a bit of a recap.